Good morning or good afternoon to our brothers and sisters and siblings, wherever you are. Um, Thank you for taking your time out on this Sunday to join the Teamsters Human Rights and Diversity Commission and the Teamsters History Project, along with training and grants for our webinar on the carriers and preservers of democracy, a century of brotherhood of sleeping car porters. This program will be presented by Eric Arnesen. He's the Teamster Professor of Modern American Labor History of George Washington University. My name is Ruben Torres. I am the Assistant Director of the HRDC. And on this webinar, we also have Anthony Rosa, who is the Director of the Human Rights and Diversity Commission. This is a reminder that if you miss any part of this meeting, it will be on our YouTube channel. And with that, I give you Eric Arnesen.
Thank you, Ruben. I am sharing my screen. And everyone has this all right?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Excellent. Let me begin 100 years ago. Literally a century ago, last month, on August 25th, 1925, between 200 and 500 Pullman sleeping car porters, accounts differ on the number, gathered in a large hall in Harlem's Imperial Lodge of Elks for what African-American newspapers called, quote, the greatest mass meeting ever held by Negro working men, unquote. That was an exaggeration, but I'll let it stand. This was the first gathering of the fledgling Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a group formed 2 months earlier by a small group of dissidents, Ashley Totten, Roy Lancaster, and W.H. Desverney, and possibly several others. These were former Pullman porters meeting in a living room in New York. These men, veteran porters, were frustrated with the Pullman Company and its company union. They invited A. Philip Randolph to meet with them. They broached the topic of unionization. Now, Randolph was a figure that was familiar to them. He was a fixture in Harlem street protest politics. He was a rare Black socialist who edited an iconoclastic and terrific monthly journal, The Messenger. He had spoken out on behalf of Pullman porters' rights before. And on that day, in June, these men in that living room quietly established the Brotherhood, selecting Randolph as its president. And as someone who did not work for Pullman, one journalist later put it, Randolph was, quote, beyond the direct vengeance of the company. So what did these folks want? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, an independent union. Higher wages, better working conditions, shorter hours. But the union's president, A. Philip Randolph, added another demand: manhood rights. Not the least amongst their claims, he explained, is, quote, that of being treated like men and not children, end quote. It was, in effect, a demand, a call for dignity. But the first task on the agenda of this new organization was winning over the 12,000 African-American porters in the employ of the Pullman Company. The second would be to overcome Pullman opposition and compel the company to recognize those manhood rights and the new union. Neither, it turned out, would prove to be a simple matter. Over the course of the next decade, they ultimately succeeded. But before we get to that uphill climb and to that victory, a bit of background is necessary. And the first question is, who were Pullman porters and why might they want to organize? These were men who worked for the Pullman Company, based in Chicago, which since 1867 had provided the traveling public with luxury railway palace cars staffed by a small army of Pullman porters who kept the cars clean, well-stocked. They catered to passengers' every whim. If you read 19th century travelers' accounts of train travel across the United States, Before this point in time, you would get a litany of woes. This was not a pleasant experience. And George Pullman's genius was to basically create what he and others would call hotels on wheels that would provide for far more comfort and far more luxury than any passenger had experienced before. And part of that provision of service in this hotel on wheels were the labors of Pullman porters. Now, Pullman hired only African American men as porters, paid them low wages that compelled them to work very hard in order to obtain tips. It employed a much smaller number of Black women to serve as maids on its train. The company's rationale was quite straightforward for why only Black men. As one Pullman associate put it, the Black Pullman porter has been, quote, trained as a race by years of personal service in various capacities and by nature adapted faithfully to perform their duties under circumstances which necessitate unfailing good nature, solicitude, and faithfulness, unquote. Well, whatever the drawbacks of this job, Black men sought out positions as porters. Those positions held out opportunities for what? Stable employment, the chance to see much of the country. That ability to travel widely made the Pullman porter a cosmopolitan in his community, the historian Clarence Lang once put it. And porters were often seen as civic pillars and even labor aristocrats in their own neighborhoods. Those seeking to unionize Pullman porters in the 1920s had an uphill fight in front of them. The Pullman Company was the single largest employer of African American labor in the United States. It made financial donations to Black hospitals, to YMCAs, to churches, to social clubs, and it expected local Black leaders to repay Pullman's paternalism by coming to the company's defense and denouncing any and all challenges to its authority or reputation. Now, and here's some graphics here from various magazines that illustrate the sense of the porter's labor and the dining car workers' labor as well. Randolph had a reputation as a powerful street speaker. He was a passionate journalist. He was a committed activist that made him an attractive choice for those seeking to build this alliance in this all but invisible union in 1925. As I said, Randolph was a socialist, and socialism had made the idea of labor organizing central to Randolph's vision. The American Federation of Labor, the dominant organization at the time, did not make that job easy. In many instances, its constituent unions discriminated or excluded Black workers altogether. But Randolph, an advocate of unionism, this was his chance to put this into practice. And he placed his monthly journal, The Messenger, at the disposal of the porters. He used its pages to critique the Pullman Company, to advertise the Brotherhood, to make the pro-union case. And organizers took aim at the racist portrayal of porters in popular culture, for one. And here you can just see a sample of some of those particular images that mocked or demeaned porters. And here you can see two additional illustrations, cartoons that come from not just popular culture, but from the Pullman Company's own monthly magazine. The white editors and the vast majority of white readers presumably found this funny. So sleeping car porter organizers required no rhetorical exaggeration when it came to these cultural portrayals of the men they sought to enlist. This was demeaning. This had to stop. And as for Pullman's treatment of its Black labor force, Brotherhood organizers portrayed these men as virtual slaves of the country. In very truth, Randolph thundered, the Pullman porter has no rights which the Pullman Company is bound to respect. The company had deprived porters of their manhood, he charged, and that had to change. And so the Brotherhood was engaged in a quote-unquote fight for economic emancipation. Now, that was one of the phrases, of a number of phrases, along with economic freedom, the unfinished task of emancipation, the next emancipation, or the unfinished revolution, phrases that Randolph and his allies used repeatedly over the next decade. But whatever the precise wording, the phrases spoke to an economic dimension of the civil rights struggle, a dimension that often gets overlooked in civil rights histories and in popular portrayal of the civil rights movement. In her excellent book on the Porters Union's first decades, historian Beth Bates, an old friend of mine, once noted that Porters, quote, pressed the claim that they had the right as Americans to live and work on an equal basis with white Americans. The memory of slavery, she said, provided the subtext of the battle to claim economic citizenship, unquote. So above all, there was a quest for racial dignity. This lay at the heart of the Brotherhood's campaign for the Porters' allegiance. Porters and maids have changed, Randolph insisted, just as the entire Negro race has changed. The new Porters' creed was, quote, independence without insolence, courtesy without fawning, service without servility, opportunity without alms, unquote. And it was only through organization, that is, joining the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, that Pullman porters could put to rest the old porter and ensure the creation of a new one. Well, that proved to be no simple matter. The Brotherhood's leaders created a mythology around their union's history, and here is a passage on the screen from a speech that Randolph delivered at the Brotherhood's convention in 1938 after it secured its major victories. And I quote, prodded and aroused by 60 or 70 years of oppression by the Pullman Company, the Brotherhood, like a prairie fire, swept the nation. Porters from the four corners of America flocked to its colors, unquote. Well, that wasn't exactly right. It certainly was an exaggeration. Randolph did acknowledge that Pullman forces got into action to stop the Brotherhood's forward advance, but still, in the telling of the story, the Porters had attracted the vast majority of members to its ranks. But the Pullman Company, as Randolph pointed out, did get into action. You'll recall a moment ago when I mentioned that Pullman financed many an institution in the Black community, that it was the single largest employer of Black labor in the United States. Those things earned the company considerable goodwill and allies. When the Brotherhood first tried to mobilize support within the community, the Black community, Beth Bates noted, some members of the elite claimed that the Brotherhood threatened to bite the hand that feeds you, with its challenge to the Pullman Company considered a friend of Black labor in many circles. What this meant was they came to the company's defense. They denounced the Brotherhood. They warned porters not to join. And so the Union had a decade-long battle from 1925 to 1935, during which the Pullman Company unleashed a barrage of hostile attacks against the young Union, and the crackdown was almost successful. There were times in the early 1930s where observers would essentially write the obituary of the Brotherhood. Between Pullman repression and the Great Depression, the porters took a beating. But along the way, they never stopped singing their own praises, criticizing the company, keeping up a steady drumbeat of positive publicity on unionization's behalf. And it turns out they survived and they triumphed. Over the course of the late 20s and the early 1930s, the union reached out successfully to white liberals and to Black leaders, members of the Black elite. And when it launched its crusade in 1925 in search of recognition and dignity, it confronted a Black elite, as Beth Bates alluded, that was largely, if not entirely, indifferent or hostile to unions. Part of it was Pullman's beneficence, its paternalism, the funds that it provided to Black institutions, and part of it was the rather sorry track record of white trade unions in the previous decades, unions that had rejected Black membership, that at times went on strike to prevent the employment of Black workers. So if the labor movement was the American Federation of Labor, and the labor movement was composed largely overwhelmingly of white workers, it was not a hospitable place. Why ally with an alleged ally that wants to exclude you rather than with a company that wants to employ you and fund your community institutions? So it made sense that at least some members of the Black working class and the Black elite would be hostile to the labor movement in the late 1920s. But what Randolph and fellow organizers in the Brotherhood did was to cultivate people. They cultivated leaders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. They cultivated clergymen. They went and cultivated members of African American Women's Club, and many came around. By the early 1930s, Beth Bates once wrote, Black old guard leaders began to view labor unions, collective solidarity, and grassroots mobilization as important tools in the ongoing fight for first-class citizenship, unquote. And one can make a case, and I would join Beth Bates in doing so, that more than any other single institution, single organization, the Brotherhood contributed to this historic shift of opinion among Black workers and the Black middle class from anti-unionism or indifference toward unionism into the pro-union camp. I could go on all day, but I won't. So I will make a long story short. As I noted, the Brotherhood survived, the Brotherhood triumphed. With the backing of President Franklin Roosevelt and New Deal labor legislation, the Brotherhood prevailed in 1935. It decisively won a government-supervised union representation election. 2 years later, in 1937, it negotiated an unprecedented and path-breaking contract with the Pullman Company. Now, in Black America, the Porter's victory resonated deeply. For his leadership, one observer noted, Randolph is currently the ranking hero of the race, and his journeys are in the nature of triumphal tours, unquote. Or, once again, to cite my old friend Beth Bates, I think she put it aptly. By the time the Brotherhood won its contract from Pullman in 1937, she said, the Porters could do no wrong in the eyes of the community and its leaders. The shift was historic. The effort of the BSCP contributed significantly to changing the anti-union perspectives embraced by a large portion of the Black leadership class. So what difference did the BSCP make in the lives of its members, in the experience of the larger Black working class population, and to the broader society? The answer that I would suggest is, well, the Brotherhood mattered greatly. To Pullman porters, union recognition and a union contract significantly improved their economic well-being. They got higher wages. They got reduced hours. It also conferred a modicum of respect and dignity on the job. They had a grievance procedure. Previously, they served at the whim of their supervisors, who could abuse them, who could discharge them. Now, they could bring a case, they could present evidence, they could challenge arbitrary managerial authority that was directed against them. And I would argue the Brotherhood provided its members with an organizational springboard that allowed them to more easily and extensively engage in community and civic affairs. In the process, I'd suggest, Beth Bates suggests, others have suggested, this is not new on my part, Randolph and the Brotherhood helped to forge a new kind of labor organization that fused, yes, traditional workplace concerns with a larger civil rights agenda. What did the Brotherhood do? It actively opposed Southern poll taxes. It supported anti-lynching legislation. Union activists advocated consumer cooperatives. They sponsored Black History Week celebrations. They taught labor history classes to their members and to their communities. They participated in Spend Your Money Where You Work campaigns designed to open up jobs in otherwise all-white businesses. And the term that historians use to describe this multifaceted effort, this unionism that attended to both workplace and broader community and political concerns, is simply civil rights unionism, a phrase that I think very much describes the agenda and energies of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. As it turns out, the Brotherhood remains perhaps the best known Black trade union. The Brotherhood had a keen sense of its historical role, its mission, a notion that it was actually making history, and it made it easy for historians to reconstruct and to appreciate its efforts by leaving behind a vast paper trail in numerous archives. The Library of Congress, the Schomburg Center of New York Public Library, the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley, the Chicago History Museum, the Newberry Library, and a number of other archives. You can find collections pertaining to Pullman Porters and the Brotherhood's efforts in the campaign for recognition and dignity on the job. And as a result, you can see from the slide here, from these various book covers, well, historians have not ignored the Brotherhood. One little asterisk I'll make here. The Brotherhood absolutely broke ground. It was critical in shifting opinion in the Black community away from an anti or neutral union stance toward a pro-union stance. But it didn't come out of the blue. It wasn't the first effort of Black trade unions. If I had all afternoon and you didn't have other things to do on your Sunday, I would go in great detail, I promise I won't, about the broader history out of which the Brotherhood emerged. In the late 19th century, despite the sorry track record of so much of organized white labor, there was nonetheless a tradition of African-American trade unionism in the coal mines, in the American South, on various Gulf and South Atlantic ports, longshoremen, miners, and others. We're talking tens of thousands of people, of African-American workers, joined unions for the same reason that white workers did, which is they wanted representation, they wanted better conditions, they wanted dignity on the job. And so that tradition of Black trade union organizing is something that doesn't really make its way into many museums. It doesn't make its way sufficiently, I would argue, into any number of survey textbooks in African-American history, but it's an important story, one that I've shared in part before with the Teamsters, and one that undoubtedly I will share again at some point in the future. So I just wanted to kind of establish that point to put the Porters into a context. But what the Porters did in the mid-20th century, in the 1930s and beyond, was to kind of reestablish that tradition and to challenge white trade unions for the mantle of what is the labor movement, who is a member of the labor movement. And the Brotherhood inspired lots, and I mean lots, of other Black workers to organize. In the railroad industry, to give one example, Porters soon had company from redcaps, the men who carried bags to and from trains in railway stations. This was a group that decades ago, I confess, I had never heard of before. I had never encountered it in any labor histories that I had read. And at the Department of Labor Library, in their wonderful open stacks at the time, I was searching for something that I could not find, but next to where it was supposed to be was this journal here, Bags and Baggage. A union journal about the United Transport Service Employees of America, previously the United Brotherhood of International Brotherhood of Redcaps. And I didn't know what redcaps were. I came of age after the golden age of rate train travel. But I saw this and I said, I don't know what it is, but I think it's very important. And then I wind up copying the Union Journal. Since then, it's now digitally available on various university libraries websites. And I was able to tell the story in an earlier book of Redcap union organizing that took its initial inspiration in large part from what the sleeping car porters themselves were doing. And they had played a role in the organization of this independent Red Caps union. There were dining car workers who organized as well and were part of the AFL. And this gospel of trade unionism that the Brotherhood was so important in spreading, carried forth, went beyond railroaders' ranks. By 1943, some 400,000 African American workers had joined the labor movement, some in AFL unions, but many in the new Congress of Industrial Organizations, the Industrial Labor Federation, the CIO, which aggressively recruited Black workers along with whites. Okay, so the Brotherhood contributed to the expansion of trade unionism amongst the Black working class. What about the broader society? The Brotherhood was not just a union concerned with its members' well-being, though it certainly did that. It was also, I guess I would say, a political organization that put civil rights at the forefront of its agenda. I would argue that the history of 20th century civil rights cannot be told, or rather cannot be told accurately, without regard to the Brotherhood's role. And unfortunately, many civil rights histories leave that role out. To reconstruct the Brotherhood's contribution to the longer history of civil rights in the 20th century would take me and you all afternoon, so I'm not going there. I will offer you a thumbnail version. And I will start that thumbnail version with the period immediately following the Brotherhood's union election and its winning of a contract with the Pullman Company. 1939, 1940, the Great Depression in the United States has devastated Black and white communities. The coming of World War II abroad began the ending of the Great Depression. Production picked up. But as it turned out, the Great Depression ended sooner for some Americans, white Americans, than it did for others, African Americans. And Black workers often found themselves excluded from the new defense jobs that the war was making possible. Here are two graphics from various newspapers in the early 1940s that speak to the exclusion of Black workers. The one on the right of your screen, I think, needs very little explanation. If the United States is supporting allies opposed to Nazi Germany, well, American industry in need of new labor, adhering to a policy of hiring no African Americans. Let's just say the American employers are giving the salute to the Nazi hand in the far on the right side of that screen. So what to do about this? During the Second World War, the Brotherhood was the backbone of the March on Washington movement. Randolph, his chief lieutenant, Milton Webster, were galled at the notion that the United States was gearing up to aid allies in the fight for democracy abroad that did not exist for African Americans here at home. And they proposed a new organization. Randolph just announces it, and initially says 10,000 African Americans, then 50,000 at 1.75, then finally 100,000 African Americans. This would be an all-Black demonstration, would descend upon the nation's capital to demand the integration of the armed forces. The military was a strictly Jim Crow operation, and they called for the desegregation of highly segregated or exclusionary defense industries. In the end, they forced the hand of President Roosevelt. Roosevelt's allies feared that any such demonstration would be a provocation. There might be racial violence, even racial riots. Blood might flow in the streets of Washington, D.C., and this would demonstrate American weakness in the eyes of allies and enemies alike abroad. And long story short, at the 11th hour, Roosevelt blinks, issues something called Executive Order 8802 that effectively bans discrimination in the defense program. That is, companies that receive military contracts from the government to produce defense weaponry and material ostensibly could not discriminate on the basis of race. And to ensure that this executive order was carried out, the president created the Fair Employment Practice Committee, the FEPC, whose members had the authority to, investigate, to look into, to cast a light on problems and attempt to bring parties together and resolve differences. This was not a strong federal agency. It did not have subpoena power. It could issue findings, but it had no power to enforce them. Some in the Black community used the phrase, the greatest thing for Negroes since the Emancipation Proclamation, quote unquote. It wasn't. Randolph knew it, the Brotherhood knew it, everyone knew it, but it had its place. For the first time, it placed the federal government on record as opposing employment discrimination, at least in one particular area, and it became a platform for publicizing Black workers' suffering and the injustices that they experienced on a regular basis, and a platform for challenging discrimination and exclusion. And in some places it had some success, in other places it didn't. It was something of a political football, and considerable organizing went into keeping the FEPC alive and keeping that spotlight on racial inequality in the labor market. Here are two graphics from the World War II era. I particularly like the one on the right that speaks to the ongoing problems that African Americans experienced during the course of the war, Jim Crow in the military, the four freedoms that don't apply to African Americans, the poll tax, lynching, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this cartoon here from the Chicago Defender similarly highlights those same problems. And this is kind of highlights, the sense that many felt during the course of the war, something I alluded to a second ago. The rhetoric of democracy is thick. It is invoked constantly. The United States, Great Britain, allies fighting Nazi tyranny, and yet African Americans are being drafted, are being asked to serve in a military that excludes them from some branches and jobs, that discriminates them against them on others, that segregates them everywhere. At the same time, all of these social problems, speaking to inequality in the United States, continue unaddressed. And for the war's duration, members of the Brotherhood and members of countless other organizations constituted, in effect, a civil rights movement before what we think of as the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. And there were protests in union halls, from church pulpits, in parks and stadiums around the country on behalf of the FEPC against discrimination in the armed forces. You can go down a long list. If anyone listening has access to newspapers.com, one of the best primary sources that I've had occasion to use, I have it on auto subscribe. I use it for my teaching and my research virtually every day. There's a wealth of African American newspapers. And if you just spend a few minutes looking at those papers from, say, World War 1940 to 1945, examples of civil rights protests will simply leap out at you. And if you don't have access to newspapers.com, the Library of Congress's Chronicling America also has a good number of African American papers, and local libraries sometimes subscribe to historical paper databases. I would invite anyone to put their foot in the water that these sources represent to get a sense of just how extensive civil rights protests were in the decade before what we think of as the civil rights movement actually emerging. If you move ahead in time, Brotherhood leaders were prominent in the now successful struggle to integrate the armed forces. This had been a demand of the March on Washington movement in 1941. It went nowhere fast. Roosevelt folded sort of, kind of, on the economic front. He was not going to mess around with the military, whose leaders were adamant that they were not a place for social experimentation, that segregation worked just fine, and there would be no integration, on their watch. Now, several years later, in 1948, Randolph and others launch a civil disobedience campaign. They call on young African American men to refuse enlistment or induction into the armed forces if the armed forces remain segregated. Prison is better than Army Jim Crow service. You can see Randolph on the left side of that photograph, marching in front of the Democratic National Convention that year. Another long story short, this is an election year, and as angry as many in the Truman administration are about this threat, they call this potential treason. Nonetheless, Truman signs an executive order that begins the gradual desegregation of the armed forces. And so by the time of the Korean War, this is a process that, despite military brass resistance, finally is underway in a real manner. Randolph, from his first moments as a street speaker and as a radical journalist, sang the gospel of trade unionism, the gospel of interracial unionism for whites, and the gospel of unionism and interracial unionism for African Americans as well. His union becomes part of the American Federation of Labor, which remains a highly problematic institution with regard to civil rights through the 1950s and the 1960s. Year after year, Randolph would go to AFL conventions. Year after year, he would introduce resolutions denouncing segregation, calling for the expulsion of unions that practiced segregation, calling on the Federation to dispatch organizers into Black communities to organize Black workers. And year after year, the AFL largely ignored him. You could find editorials in the Black press, some critical of Randolph, some appreciative of him, that basically talk about this annual ritual where Randolph will go make his impassioned speech, pitch to his colleagues who would essentially, blow him off, ignore him, mock him, or attack him. This was like an annual ritual, raising these issues and getting kicked for doing so. But year after year, he came back. Milton Webster came back. Other Black trade unionists came back, and they kept the issue of trade union discrimination, which was, in many cases, legal. There was no law preventing unions from taking only white members or whoever they wanted to take into their ranks. But they kept up a steady drumbeat of protest. Randolph becomes a vice president of the newly united AFL-CIO in 1955, and he keeps at it, arguing, heading a major moral revolution against racial discrimination within the labor movement. This piece from the Chicago Defender notes. He leads any number of conferences, educational sessions, small organizations, and then in 1960 creates the Negro American Labor Council that brings together Black union officials, elected and administrative, from around the country to continue hammering the AFL on its still sorry track record on civil rights. And with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's a new ballgame. Title VII, which in many ways is the reincarnation of the Fair Employment Practice Committee, the FEPC of the World War II era. Title VII effectively puts an end to legal discrimination in both industries. Above small firms are excluded, but of a certain size, and in the labor movement. The struggle continues, but a significant step forward has been taken. Then there was the struggle for civil rights in the broader society. Members of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters were active, very active in civil rights, not just in the 1940s, but in the 1950s and in the 1960s as well, with some of their activists and leaders playing a profound role in the new movement that emerged. This is a piece from the black paper, The Omaha Guide, from 1956, that highlights an earlier work by a French writer, a French left-wing writer, about Black protests in the 1940s, largely. And it applies what that writer said to the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, 1956. And what is the source of strength of the then 5-month-old protest movement against racial segregation in buses in Montgomery? Why is it the best organized mass protest movement of Negroes in the South have seen in generations? ... And the answer, in part, comes from the people who were involved in this. Out of working class unionism, the writer noted, emerged a group of Negro leaders who found themselves simultaneously calling in positions in labor and promoting the ranks of leaders in the Negro community. And they single out a gentleman named E.D. Nixon of Montgomery, Alabama, who was central to the launch and the maintenance of the boycott. And men like Nixon, just to name one, the authors of this editorial, quoting this French writer, says, culminates the alliance that has at last been consummated between race and labor. That's pushing it a bit. But still, Nixon was an activist with the NAACP and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And so when the Montgomery boycott is launched, credit is given by the union to Nixon, not the young minister who ostensibly runs this thing, the Montgomery Improvement Association. And I've always loved this slide, this excerpt here. Bombs go off in the home of some of the union leaders. The bombing was the second incident of its kind in a week, the first being the bombing of the home of a Negro minister, Reverend L.M. King Jr., who, like Nixon, is also a leader in the boycott of the Montgomery buses. So they get Martin Luther King Jr.'s name wrong. And so for them, Nixon's the one. He is the man, the driving force behind this boycott. And he certainly played an instrumental role in its success. Then, to give another example, the killing of young Emmett Till in Mississippi, his lynching at the hands of several white supremacists. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was not alone in raising its voice in horror and in opposition to what happened. It was one of many unions involved in this broader struggle, but in New York City, it was the sponsor of a protest demonstration of some 15,000, another account has 20,000, rallying a cry by Randolph of the Brotherhood to protest the brutal killing of Emmett Till. And the union president termed the trial and killing, the article notes, a national disgrace, and implied that federal troops should be sent into the South to enforce justice, unquote. There are many, many other examples, but just to bring this to a close more quickly, the March on Washington in 1963, often attributed to Dr. King, brought 250,000 people to the nation's capital. The march was the brainchild of a now aging Randolph and engaged the energies of many Brotherhood members. The march is reduced in popular thinking to the efforts of Dr. King. The march, one man, one march, one speed. I tell my students, if anyone ever put that on a paper or an exam, I would fail the question. King was but one of many people and wasn't, frankly, the most important in driving forward this particular demonstration. And yes, we all have to acknowledge how important the Dream speech was, but there were other very significant speeches that day. And the punchline here that I want to stress is what King's speech has done is to highlight it's about freedom angle. But the other term, the preceding term in the title of the march, jobs, March on Washington for Jobs and Justice, is the one that often gets left by the wayside. But for the organizers like Bayard Rustin here in this photograph, and for A. Philip Randolph and for many, many others, civil rights without economic rights was something of a dead end. The two were absolutely connected and could not in practice be separated. Now, I just want to say a few words about the state of African American history, of which this story is a large part today. And I don't know, a year ago, I wouldn't have had to make this final digression before wrapping up. But I will say, and end this here. I will say that today a cloud hangs over the teaching of African American history in the United States. In its war on diversity, equity, and inclusion, when the Trump administration first came into power, you might say it declared war on Black history. Linda McMahon, the Secretary of Education nominee at the time, could not say for certain when asked by a Connecticut senator whether the teaching of a certain African American history course in his kid's high school would be in violation of the new executive order against DEI. And she responded, "I have to get back to you on that." This is to a US senator. She could not flat out say that an African American history class could be taught in public schools without violating Trump's DEI ban. And in subsequent weeks and in subsequent months, various agencies put an end to what are called identity months. So Black History Month, Women's History Month, National Disability History Month. These were now forbidden. At one point, references to the Tuskegee Airmen were dropped from government websites. Then they were reinstated. Even Republican congressmen objected. Ditto to World War II era Navajo codebreakers. Information about Black, Hispanic, and women veterans was scrubbed from the website of the Arlington National Cemetery. And then the administration took aim at the Smithsonian Institute in general and its African American History Museum in particular, leveling a number of just false charges against them. Really, the African American History Museum, I have quibbles about this or that exhibit or this or that claim, but it's a magnificent museum. And I'm a very grumpy museum attendee. I often have my criticism. This one, ultimately, I have to say, hats off. And then most recently, last week, the National Park Service announced it was going to be purging displays on slavery, on Japanese internment, and on climate change from exhibits at its national parks. Now, maybe these policies and threats won't stand. Maybe they will. Maybe the courts will block this or that in particular. But whatever the case ultimately may turn out to be, it is clear that at this moment, Black history is very much under attack. And from my perspective, that is all the more reason to teach it, to explore it, and debate it. Let me just finish by turning to the title of my talk that were taken from remarks that A. Philip Randolph gave in 1926 before thousands of people at a Philadelphia celebration. "Can the victims of slavery," he said, "be the carriers and preservers of democracy?" Actually, there are 60,000 people present to that day. And his answer to his rhetorical question was, yes, in no small measure. The Negro status in America has been a test of American democracy. The insistent cry for freedom on the part of the Negro has kept the American people face to face with the fact that a democracy has not fulfilled its highest mission so long as there are people in this country, Black or white, who cannot participate in the affairs of government, industry, or society generally as free, intelligent human beings, unquote. And from the 1920s through the 1960s, when an aging group of Pullman porters essentially moved off stage, the Brotherhood, whose members had descended from those victims of slavery, I would suggest, in many ways, self-consciously served as those carriers of and preservers of democracy. Let me end on that note, and hopefully you all have something to say. You can challenge, qualify, add, ask questions. I will open this up to anyone with thoughts on their mind.
Well, Eric, I want to thank you for your in-depth presentation. Always a wealth of knowledge and well needed. We need to be educated on our past so we can move forward in the future. My question to you, though, is when Randolph was constantly going to the conventions and standing up for integrated unions, did he have any allies that were notable in that fight, or basically he was alone in that struggle?
He had some allies. The teachers union and the some of the clothing and garment workers unions, would back him, but there were far more opposition than there was support directed his way. And at best, people like President William Green would create yet another committee to look into, investigate, and make recommendations on. At worst, they simply dismissed him altogether. So there were some supporters, but not enough to carry the day.
Understood. And then another question. In his constant battle, did he have um, an apprentice or someone he was mentoring to carry on his legacy and his vision for unions?
That's a very good question. And the answer that I would offer in terms of mentorship is no, but he did surround himself. He had a cohort of Brotherhood organizers, C.L. Dellums on the West Coast, Ashley Totten and others that he worked with on a regular basis. One could say they didn't need any mentoring. They didn't need any cultivating to carry this forth. They were part of the Brotherhood apparatus. There was the Women's Auxiliary.
Sit there for a minute.
Women's Auxiliary, Rosina Tucker, Helena Wilson, who were leaders in their own right, working with women, wives, daughters, mothers of Pullman porters, engaging in many of these same types of activity. Randolph spoke nonstop, maybe an exaggeration, but close to nonstop across the country before other groups of Black workers. So when I read, for example, there are several African-American papers from Omaha, Nebraska. So he shows up in Omaha and hundreds of people are in the audience who are trade unionists, dining car workers, others, Pullman porters. And so he serves as this inspirational figure, as do other sleeping car porter activist organizers. So I wouldn't say he kind of cultivated in a mentorship way, but he did work with, provided employment opportunities for, and his own efforts were enabled by a whole cast of characters, some of whom went on to very illustrious careers, running for state assemblyman or working in the New York City government and other such places.
Thank you, Eric. Are there any more questions for Mr. Arnesen? Any comments, thoughts?
Comment, it's Anthony Rosa. I just want to say thank you, Eric. I enjoy when you teach a class, the history that you leave us with, and I appreciate you. I want to say thank you.
Always my pleasure. Carry on.
Okay, hearing no more comments or questions, I want to thank you once again for taking your time to spend with us. And once again, if you missed any part of this presentation, it is available on our YouTube channel. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in the next webinar.